This was one of those videos where Charles took stock of the whole Cardano world and explained to us where Cardano is on the spectrum of expressiveness, where we're headed, and what it really means that it all has to happen through the lens of decentralization. Ready? Let's go. This was a sprawling 1 hour video covering the entire philosophy of Cardano and how that philosophy is being executed on. I would highly encourage you to go watch the actual video, but I know not everybody has a spare hour they can devote to this. So we're going to try to cover all the material in a really concise manner. That means we're going to have to go pretty fast to cover everything. In this video, which Charles called Whiteboard dApps and Development, there's a larger overarching theme. As we go through the beginning, it's going to seem like some of these disparate pieces don't have any connection, but I'm hoping the overarching idea will become apparent and everything will kind of connect by the end. So the video started out with our friend Logan the Lobster up there on the mic stand looking very healthy. I didn't notice any signs of premature molting or any other things that might affect a stuffed lobster. He's looking good. Charles began by reading a few quotes from a paper on EUTXO versus account style paradigms by Lars Brunius and Murdoch J. Gabby. The conclusion is that account models lend themselves to imperative programming, while EUTXO lends itself to functional programming, since an EUTXO smart contract is essentially a function that takes a UTXO list as its input and produces a UTXO list as its output with no other dependencies. Charles points out that some things work more easily in an imperative style than in a purely functional one, so he believes in a multi paradigm world that blends both imperative and functional styles. Charles then described a spectrum of expressiveness from Bitcoin script, which you already understand if you understand how UTXOs work. We've discussed that many times on this channel, to things like at the other end of the spectrum, the Java virtual machine, which is a full programming environment that things like Minecraft are built on. The next part is probably going to seem a little reminiscent of discussions we've had previously about the challenges and trade offs of the blockchain trilemma. That very far, most expressive end of the spectrum, where the JVM is, creates a big and open attack surface for a blockchain and hurts security, while the other end of the spectrum, with less expressiveness and very high security, is the Bitcoin script end of the spectrum. Obviously, I'm not trying to erroneously imply that the JVM is a blockchain of some sort. We're just talking about that level of expressiveness. Charles places the Ethereum virtual machine some unspecified distance short of the end of the spectrum that corresponds to extreme expressiveness, the JVM side, explaining that Ethereum had to restrict some things for security. The question then becomes, where does or should extended unspent transaction output fall? Where should EUTXO, like in Cardano, fall? Charles pegs it currently at some point about halfway between Bitcoin script and the JVM side, that extremely expressive side, and some distance less expressive than the EVM. Charles points out that the EVM is very hard to scale because of global state, and the increased expressiveness of the EVM versus where EUTXO is now creates a lot of things for an adversary to exploit. He points out they've already created 3 CIPs, Cardano Improvement Proposals, in conjunction with the Cardano DeFi projects that increase expressiveness some amount. This increasing expressiveness and trying to hit the perfect spot on the spectrum, some spot in between where the EV or the where EUTXO is on the spectrum now and where EVM is, trying to hit the perfect spot on the spectrum between those two is going to be a big piece of what Cardano will be doing over the next 6 to 9 months. Charles points out that we can do this while preserving local state and functional programming. So we can sort of have our cake and eat it too. That is, keep very, very high security and still have these increased levels of expressiveness. Charles then explains that these functions that deal only with inputs and outputs in a UTXO or EUTXO system are mathematical objects that can be modeled. This allows for property-based testing so that you can have specifications, verifications, and certifications so that ultimately you can have high assurance that a smart contract is correct as implemented and behaves in a predictable manner. This is extremely expensive in an imperative global state world like Ethereum, but much cheaper and easier in a functional deterministic context like Cardano. What Charles just laid out there is crucial. We're not just trying to solve the blockchain trilemma anymore. The blockchain trilemma is simultaneously achieving decentralization, scaling, and security. Now we're trying to solve the blockchain quadlemma, if you will. The blockchain quadlemma sounds even more ridiculous, right? The blockchain quadlemma would be simultaneously solving for decentralization, scaling, and security while also achieving a high level of expressiveness, because we're not just trying to transact in value, we're also doing smart contract stuff. So we need that high level of expressiveness along with simultaneous with the solutions for the three parts of the blockchain trilemma. So, blockchain quadlemma. Scaling was a part of that. So, next, Charles talked about network optimization. They'll continue increasing the block size. You remember we already had a 12.5% increase in block size, and they'll keep increasing that block size until they approach the limit imposed by propagation time. They want 95% of the peers on the network to have received the block in 5 seconds. So, obviously, once they start bumping up against that 5 second propagation time to 95% of the peers, then they're going to have to take the foot off the pedal on the block size increase. They're also optimizing libraries and the core node to increase performance. We've heard about all this before. Charles also said that pipelining will be happening simultaneously, where processing nodes are doing work during the normal dead times between blocks. Those are the little red hash marks. No crypto pun intended there. Those little red lines in between the blocks you can see at the bottom of his diagram. Charles then gave us a very detailed, wide ranging, sprawling explanation of the different approaches that different DAGs and different other various Gen 3 projects have taken to scaling. But the gist of it is that pipelining plus input endorsers can get us to 500 to 1,000 transactions per second, with those transactions being mixed scripts and value transactions. That's to say, some transactions where people are just sending assets around and some smart contract transactions. We can get there without any slashing. Then, if you want to go higher, you can engage in optimizing the network further and maybe even slashing if you want. Obviously, the lack of slashing is a huge selling point for Ouroboros, but when Charles was talking about that, I believe he was describing sort of the hypothetical where you want to get to extremely high TPS uh, rates. And in that hypothetical situation, you're creating an environment where you have to use economic punishments to ensure the right behaviors. But he points out that the higher and higher you go in terms of TPS, you start losing safety in the system and decentralization. Charles subtly joked that you can become so centralized that you occasionally will have to reset your network, which he thinks means you're not really a cryptocurrency anymore. This was an obvious reference to Solana. He says they'll be making some blog posts on all of this, and he's trying to get pipelining and input endorsers done by the October hard fork. Remember, we have 3 hard fork windows now per year in Cardano. He says he doesn't care who they have to hire, or even if it costs him tens of millions of dollars. He wants pipelining and input endorsers in place in 2022. Next up, the discussion turned to all things off chain. EUTXO, with its local state and determinism, makes it really easy to do things off chain in 3 ways. The first is Hydra. This is just that good old fashioned idea around payment and state channels. They're already on the testnet with Hydra. The SPOs will run it, and it'll be nearly feeless. He wants Hydra 1.0 this year. In terms of state channels, he mentions later on in his discussion, after he's already covered some other topics, that one of the reasons that Bitcoin has had so much trouble with state channels is that it lacks too much expressiveness. Number 2 was off chain computing. This is going to be a big area of research with many different approaches. SPOs will also be perfect for this role. Charles said that all the DEXs are currently doing something like this. This makes me think of all the sort of off chain order matching and off chain order batching that we've seen various different decentralized exchange projects talk about. Number three is side chains. Ouroboros gives us a very strong root of trust. We can just pick a subset of stake pool operators, SPOs, for every epic even, and have them be a permissioned quorum and run very, very fast or specialized side chains. Side chains might be things like Yella, the EVM, or Catalyst. This would also be the Cardano computation layer from the old Cardano settlement layer, Cardano computation layer, CSL and CCL, that distinction that was often mentioned in the early days of Cardano. You could tell that IOHK has been putting a lot of thought into additional possible revenue streams for the stake pool operators. Obviously, this will be very welcomed by especially the single stake pool operators because there's so much competition for the delegates, and I think they deserve it since they're all contributing to the decentralization of the Cardano network. Charles also went on to mention things like script compression, batching, rollups. Next, Charles addressed a question that seems to be on a lot of people's lips. That question is when PAB? And Charles definitely seemed a little frustrated by all those questions. I understand why so many people are asking about WinPab because I think just because of the nomenclature, giving the name Plutus application backend to what's essentially just a library with many different components, it sort of created a monolithic kind of conception of a single PAB, a binary thing. And when it came out, all these dApps would be able to launch. But in fact, Charles points out it is just a library with many different components, and any given project may be using any of those components. They may need some and not others. And in fact, some of the components of the PAB are already there, they're good to go. Others are still being built out. So I think the PAB is, I don't think there's going to be any defined endpoint on this question of when the PAB will be in place. It's more a process of IOHK building out different components of the PAB and figuring out which projects need what types of components. We've already seen some progression on this. Of course, none of this addresses the scenario we've discussed in the past where certain projects seem to be building out their own sort of bespoke PAB components. I think Charles did a good job here of acknowledging this for what it is. They took the UTXO system of Bitcoin and added a functional programming smart contract layer to it. This is some pioneering stuff. This is brand new. In my mind, they're trying to solve not just the blockchain trilemma now, but the blockchain quadlemma. That's a pioneering and important effort. However, not all the components are quite ready. So he said, and I believe without any malice, he said, hey, if you have some kind of a compelling economic business case why you must deploy now, why you cannot wait for these components to be completed, we've got a currently available EVM sidechain in Cardano. You can go build over there. You can use all the Ethereum tooling, Solidity. It's an imperative language. You can build it out over there. It's all available. And Solidity's been around for years now. We kind of know about Solidity. We know what it is. It's a known quantity. We know what its shortcomings are. And part of that is why Cardano exists. But it's available and it's a known quantity. So people can build out over there. In the grand scheme of things, I don't think that's really going to impact this pioneering EUTXO effort. I hope you are starting out a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.